thank you all for coming this afternoon. As many of you will know, climate change and security has been a research focus of the IISS for about 7 years. We pretty much started our program around the time of the release of the fourth IPCC assessment report, and one of our speakers today, Professor Neil Adger, was a leading author on that report. Since that time, the research on climate change and security worldwide has ramped up quite a bit, including within the Institute. And in the new Working Group 2 report from the IPCC, the fifth assessment report that just came out last week, there's a chapter on human security, which there wasn't in the previous report. And included within that, there's extensive coverage of the research on climate change and security. Professor Neil Adger, our first speaker, was the make sure I get the winner, convening lead author on that chapter, and was also involved last week in the summary for policymakers for the entire Working Group 2 report. The rest of his biography is rather extensive, and you'll all have seen it on the announcement. And our second speaker as well, Professor Clin O'Reilly from the University of Sussex, has also been doing a lot of work on climate change and security, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm particularly pleased that we have her here to speak today because her approach and methodology is somewhat different, and I would hope to say complementary to the kind of more qualitative and case-based work that we do at the Institute. The speakers will each talk for about 15 minutes, and that will leave us officially a half hour for Q&A and discussion, which I expect will be lively. And we do have the room for longer than that if people want to carry on after the official end time. So I'll hand over to Neil.
Thank you. So my thesis today is that climate change is already here. The impacts are significant and consequential, and that no place in the world is immune from them. That climate change adaptation is already happening, and that in fact responding to climate change is becoming a challenge of managing risks. These risks, we say in the report, are significant at present, but are likely to become much more significant if we don't decarbonise the economy and we head towards higher levels of impacts that are going to have severe and pervasive impacts, as we say in the report, on life and livelihood and on the natural world. And that effective adaptation, so this is not a prophecy of doom, but because effective adaptation, this is the crux of this part of the IPCC's report, can lead to a safer and more resilient world. Now, for the first time, the IPCC in this report, in the Working Group 2 report, has embraced a fire hose of scientific and social science research on climate change, and is beginning to see climate change not necessarily in its in isolation and trying to isolate the impact of climate on trends in society and the environment, but actually to see it as one of the other risks, or one of the sort of parameters in which the world is going to move forward over the next decades. In saying that, so the report, this part of the report, the IPCC, the Working Group 1 is about the physical and climate science. We reported in October last year. This impacts adaptation and vulnerability report reported and was approved by the UN process last week. And next week, or as we speak today, they're in the plenary sessions for the Working Group 3 report, which is on the mitigation options. The IPCC doesn't do new research. It holds a mirror up to the research community and says, look, this is what you say. If you look in the mirror and you don't like what you see, then that's really a product of what the underlying science is. This report was written by 309 authors, with a whole load of additional contributing authors, which Cliona is one. Those 309 authors came from 70 countries. We received 50,000 or so comments in various rounds of review. So it is very much from both governments and from the research community. So it is very much a product of the community, a state of knowledge of the science rather than a statement by the IPCC itself. This report, this Working Group 2 report, is in 30 chapters, a chapter on every region in the world, including much new information on the oceans, and then assessments of adaptation impacts by sector and the rest of it. It's in effect a giant literature review with 12,000 references. So what does it find? First of all, and what's new, I'll try and focus on what's new in in this report compared to others. There are widespread and observed impacts. So the impacts of climate change are already with us and are already being observed, detected and attributed in the natural world, principally in water, in ice, in plants and in animals. So all natural systems, there are detectable impacts of climate change. They are so because the world has warmed up in the last 150 years. And if you look at the bottom panel of that, which is a decadal average, the last 3 decades have been the warmest in the past 1,400 years. In the summary report, there is this graph that looks complicated. It's a map of the world with lots of little tractors and fish and things on it. And that basically is a summary of all the work where the impacts of climate change on these natural systems have already been detected. Detected with to allow us with statistical significance to isolate the impacts of climate on it. And this is irrespective of extreme events and those sorts of things. These are direct and observable and attributable impacts that include, for example, lots of changes in the oceans, lots of changes in sea level, and some of the things that the report is focused on includes a discernible impact on some of the world major agricultural commodities, particularly wheat and maize, where you see a 1 or 2% decline in potential yield directly attributable as the result of climate change. And this doesn't mean to say that yields have been going down around the world. This means that climate is a limiting factor and is an anchor and a drag or something else that has to be overcome by agricultural technology. The adaptation is already occurring around the world, and it would be inconceivable, faced with these risks, if governments didn't and individuals didn't plan and act on those behalf. And there's lots of evidence in the report about this that I can talk about. But that increasing magnitudes of warming increase the likelihood of severe and pervasive impacts. The climate scenarios that are used in the report, the new climate scenarios, or the new drivers of the climate scenarios, for those of you familiar or not familiar with them, go by the rather obscure name of RCP 2.6 right up to RCP 8.5. Concentration pathways, watts per metre squared, you name it, there's some complication in here. But RCP 2.6 is basically decarbonising the world by 2050. And in that scenario, we're still faced with significant levels of warming, up to the levels of 2 degrees, way above 2 degrees actually in the high latitudes, particularly in the north. RCP 8.5, which is effectively business as usual, and let's not decarbonise the world's economy, the scenarios are for 4 degrees and upwards. With those types of impacts, there's a plethora of information in the report about what that means, and those include changes in maximum catch potential, just one map from the report, in the world's fisheries, particularly in the tropics, declines in the red zones of up to 50%, based on just one of those scenarios, which is a medium decarbonisation scenario going forward. So there's all sorts of pervasive and consequential and negative consequences associated with this, and the same with the impact on agricultural productivity and the like. My chapter in the report, or for the first time, the IPCC looked at human security, human security being the vital core of human lives, of human life and livelihoods. Of course, human security has got all sorts of definitions and ways to think about it within the UN system. But effectively, what that part of the report, and I would encourage you to download it and look at it, looks at is the non-material impacts on place, identity, culture, the impacts on migration, where people live and the decisions they make about where they live, and about conflict, and also about national and state security, on the basis of, and you can imagine a discussion about should we be looking at state security or human security, on the basis of, in our chapter, that if governments, that if states are not able to fulfil their social contract to protect their citizens, then this is then this is a manifestation of potential human insecurity. The device I'm going to use is to pick out the statements that were agreed in the summary for policymakers adopted by governments last week, and there are 4 of them in the report, and they focus on migration, conflict, and state security. So I'll just talk about these. So this is all very, very carefully worded statements that we pored over, and governments have had a lot of I'd looked at in great detail, looked at our lines of evidence, multiple lines of evidence, and the rest of it. Climate change over the 21st century is projected to increase the displacement of people. We don't put a number on it, and by displacement we mean involuntary migration from place of residence. Often temporary, people go back. This is principally associated with extreme weather events. People get displaced from their homes. They're displaced from their homes in Somerset at the minute. People tend to return. But that impact on mobility and migration is well documented, at least with high agreement, but different lines of evidence to increase over the course of this century. Displacement risk, we find, increases when populations lack the resources for planned migration, experience higher exposure to extreme weather events. Expanding opportunities for mobility can reduce vulnerability. So in other words, migration is a legitimate and effective adaptation to weather-related risks, and there will be drift of population away from places that have high risks due to economic disinvestment, lack of insurance premiums, affecting housing markets and all sorts of things. Then we go on to say that changes in migration patterns, of course, are related both to long-term change and to extreme events, but that there is low confidence in quantitative projections of changes in mobility because of due to its complex multi-causal nature, and we do not use that R term in the report. We reject it, the term refugee in this context, which we conclude is erroneous as a matter of law and conceptually inaccurate. Climate change can indirectly increase the risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence by amplifying well-documented drivers. So basically what we're saying here is that there's multiple lines of evidence here, but climate, we can't, it's too contested, I think, to say that there is a direct link between climate and conflict in terms of resource scarcity. However, those things that are well known that are associated with violent conflict, particularly high levels of poverty and economic shocks, themselves are sensitive to climate. And therefore there is a significant reason for concern to think that climate change, its impacts, particularly if it pushes people into poverty through resource scarcity and the like, and causes economic shocks, may indirectly have an impact on violent conflict. And secondly, that, of course, violent conflict in places in conflict and post-conflict themselves are more vulnerable to climate change, and those processes, the lack of adaptive capacity, the assets that facilitate adaptation, infrastructure, social capital, natural resources, and the rest of it, are themselves directly impacted by conflict. So conflict is going to be a driving force in creating vulnerability to climate change, as, for example, demonstrated whenever you look at post-conflict countries and look at their lack of effective governance and governance index on their lack of human development. These are the things that make places and populations vulnerable to climate change. And finally, the impacts of climate change on critical infrastructure and territorial integrity are certainly another reason for concern, and something that is expected to influence security policies going forward. Land inundation in small island states and states with extensive coastal zones, for example, or assessment of transboundary resources are such that there are a variety of resources that where clearly there is interstate rivalry for them, fish stocks and shared water resources and the like. But we find no evidence so far that this has a significant risk to increase the risk of interstate conflict. We do say in the report, in our chapter, that of course, in these envelopes that we're moving to, the past may be not such a good guide to the future. We undertake some risk assessments, which I'll not go into, but the one that I will just highlight here are these sets of bars that basically say that adaptation is not going to be effective whenever it comes to those cultural issues of place, identity, and culture that are directly at risk. We can't, clearly cultures and people having to move and direct impacts are going to be. There is going to be adaptation, but actually, in terms of the social acceptability of that, I think that's pretty clear. And finally, there's cognate evidence in the report from our chapters that are clustered together on human well-being about the direct impacts on human health and well-being that are also constitutive of human security. Let me just finish by saying, in all of these areas, and again, this is the new look fit assessment, that the options for effective adaptation are there in front of us. Most of the adaptations, at least to those climates that are up to the sorts of impacts that we're going to be seeing over the next few decades in the era of climate commitment, as we're referring to it, are already well known, and that we need to begin to grasp those opportunities and document that best practice. I commend you to read the report. Thank you.
All 600 pages or 1,000 pages of it. Thanks very much. We'll save the Q&A until after the second speaker. So
thank you very much. I also recommend that you read the report. It really is fantastic and an amazing contribution to the literature and also the debate about the climate change impacts. I'm really going to focus my comments from somebody who works on conflict and of course in Africa. And to that end, the Human Security chapter, the Africa chapter, and the Emerging Risks or the Emergent Risks chapter is basically where I have gotten some quotes that I'll try and wrap my comments around. Okay, well first I would like to say that I really do think that the Human Security chapter navigated the difficult terrain of this climate, conflict, migration issue really beautifully. So as Neil has noted, it says that some of the factors that increase the risk of conflict within states are sensitive to climate change. People living in places affected by violent conflict are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and climate changes will lead to new challenges to states and will increasingly shape both the conditions of security and national security policies. And I don't think that any reasonable person could disagree with those statements. This does in some ways stand in sharp contrast to a stronger statement in Chapter 19, which states, in numerous statistical studies, the influence of climate variability on violent conflict is large in magnitude. And so both chapters do go to great pains to emphasize that the theoretical foundations, and in fact the explanations for any direct effects, and increasingly indirect effects, are largely missing from this literature. So as a summation of findings, I think Chapter 12 does that particularly well. In looking into the future, recent studies can give us some concern, but then again, there's no explanation, so we don't exactly know how strongly we can, I suppose, address the concerns within those studies. So what does this mean for conflict scholars and for government policy and a way to interpret conflict in the developing world? The main concern of conflict scholars to this or any report, of course, is that it may contribute to what's referred to, especially in Chapter 19, I suppose, the way in which conflict causes can be simplified and one-dimensional, especially with regard to African conflicts. And in doing so, often the politics is taken out of the conflict in place of the environment factors. And there's no debate really also that climate is really the cause du jour in the media, in policymakers' terms, whereas as we see in the academic community, it's really quite contested about what we should be expecting, what has happened, how it has happened, who it affected, etc. And the empirical results we see from a lot of studies come with the caveat: political and economic factors exert far more influence on the likelihood of violence than environmental factors. Now, I've used this exact phrase myself, so I know of the sins it's trying to cover. And basically what it is that your regression finds that there's some environmental factors, but then, of course, what we know, poverty, bad governance, is taking up most of the explanation. But that, and in line with what the Human Security chapter said, that in fact may be quite connected to climate change. And we don't know exactly how that is occurring yet. And so which political and economic factors are important, and how do they work to create environments that are susceptible to climate-related risks? And basically, what we need to do is stop, as conflict scholars, basing conjecture or using conjecture as a basis to say that this relationship is here. And the reason that this is important is, of course, clarity on the presence or absence of a strict climate link is really quite critical for going forward, because misdiagnosis can be quite devastating to developing economies and developing people. And so from the perspectives of governments in underdeveloped places, as we all know, climate change is only one of several threats to be addressed. And so a report like this, and it is fantastic in that it clarifies for us many of the ways in which researchers have developed pathways to understand climate change, but all reports and all conflict studies I've seen sometimes can misdiagnose what's actually happening within countries in this severely underdeveloped South. So recent research has confirmed that governments are not addressing vulnerable populations in a way that does actually support livelihoods, but rather tend to direct funds towards economically lucrative areas of their states. And while we battle in rooms like this or in workshops or conferences with whether or not we can use scarcity as a reason why we're seeing climate change conflicts, or what scarcity means, at the same time there is a very active land grabbing phenomena going on within Africa. So how these two things sit together, one in which Africa is viewed as some sort of great resource to be grabbed, another in which we talk about it in terms purely of scarcity, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that kind of relationship has to be clarified before we go forward. And I think both examples serve to underscore how governments are actively seeking to use economic development, or rather to address economic development as their priority, while climate change is part of the rhetoric used to discuss the effects on populations that governments are often not actively serving. So there may in fact be two stories going on in many African states, but one cannot be ignored in favor of the other. So the increases and the depth of vulnerability across populations within those contexts can be interpreted as a policy success and not a failure. Many of these populations are actively ignored. Now, what I'll come to in a bit later is their conflict contribution is minimal, very, very small. So, but the point here is that governments are taking advantage of this crisis, this climate crisis, very effectively to kind of wrap their concerns in a climate perspective while still engaging in quite destructive economic development policies at the same time. So if you look at the emerging violence patterns we see within sub-Saharan African states, governments are increasingly engaging in low-level violence over governance contests, and people here who may be familiar with the Kenyan example know that the Tana River violence, which was attributed to climate change because it was communal and involved some pastoralists, was in fact the government trying to ensure that due to devolution, a particular type of governor got into a position there. But because of this narrative of climate change, because of how easily we latch onto it, these conflicts are automatically regarded as contests over resources and not, in fact, contests over power, which all conflict is, just contest over power. So the conflict patterns we're seeing in Africa at the moment are very much in line with this notion that the central government is unable or unwilling to provide public goods and security in a consistent manner. In addition, the economic changes underway, as I mentioned before, cash cropping, land grabs, etc., and the political shifts, decentralization, devolution, often create new socioeconomic realities. And those changes alter the ability of groups to collectively organize. They change who those groups would target, and they change what the goals of those groups may in fact be. So, as Neil said, we may not necessarily be able to rely on the conflict patterns we've seen in the past as a good predictor of what we'll see in the future, because the socioeconomic changes are changing how people organize and what's important to them. But we do know, of course, is how likely people of any size or of any type of livelihood are able to organize and what kind of conflict they're most likely to engage in when they do. Okay. These efforts to contest change by vulnerable people, such as pastoralists or people who live in rural areas or even urban populations, they tend to become violent because there are very, very few other avenues by which they can address the changes that negatively affect them. And that's always going to be the bottom line for some of these countries where we expect violent conflict more so than we expect anything else. It's because the avenues to address any other change are limited. So, in this way, I suppose you could say that climate change is becoming part of the process by which governments shape and push and alter and enforce societal change. But the narrative of climate change conflict removes governments from the equation when they very much should be quite central to that equation. One unfortunate reality is that we could possibly say that dealing with vulnerability should be enveloped in a discussion about economic development. So if governments are going to respond much more so to policies that encourage economic development over policies that are about addressing vulnerability, then how can we talk about vulnerability in a way that is about economic development? And so the populations that we're most concerned about benefit from adaptation or mitigation funding and aren't bypassed for the economically lucrative areas of the states and the people who live there. Some other things I wanted to bring up which are quite important is that we need to be realistic about how people interpret climate change risks across developing contexts. There's a hierarchy of risk that many people in developing countries deal with. You cannot be a risk-adverse African, or else you just never leave your house. There's so many risks that you deal with every single day, whether it is farming risks about crops, or health risks, or political instability risks. The climate becomes obviously a very important factor of that, but we know from the HIV/AIDS debate that compounded risks, so risks that have something to do with each other, that make efforts to deal with, for example, your climate change risks, have less efficacy than you would hope, because your climate change risk is related to your market failure risk is related to your food risk, so on and so forth. So people end up being quite hopeless about their abilities to individually change their circumstances. And to be honest, they have no chance of individually changing their circumstances. This is, it's very much as a top-down and bottom-up measure. It would have to be a top-up and bottom-down practice in order to effectively deal with these compounded and interactive risks. And so the abilities of people to think about conflict in these scenarios, it's not the first, it's not the second, it's not the third thing people think about. They are trying to deal with many, many, many risks simultaneously. And our likelihood of thinking that they're going to engage in violent conflict is really not quite as dominant as people might think. And so I'm going to just finish with some facts, if you will. Maybe I consider them facts, but we can debate whether or not they are. So the way forward to understanding this very fundamental relationship and to avoid misdiagnosis is to look at is to look at some things that are obvious from the last few years, both in studies and in case studies. The most vulnerable are not being attended to by their governments particularly well. These people are also not likely to engage in large-scale violence, but smaller acts of consistent and cyclical violence. I run a data project, and the communal violence, which is the pastoral violence, etc., account for about 7% of all African violence, and that rate remains unchanged for about the last 20 years. Far more violence is committed by political elites contesting each other. And economic development and the related political power contests is leading to a significant increase in competition amongst elites. And that's when you see election violence, you see the violence like we see in Kenya and Zimbabwe and Nigeria with Boko Haram. These are contests over power in which the winners and losers are going to determine economic development and who benefits from them. And that, of course, is strongly affected by these very factors that we're talking about today. Climate changes in many ways. So the contest for power on the national level over economic development has losers. Those losers, of course, are the vulnerable because they don't get public goods, they don't get security, they don't get long and short-term improvements in infrastructure or adaptation or anything else. And there really isn't a social contract between the governments and those populations. That doesn't mean that these populations are going to try and overthrow the government. They're simply too small and weak to do so. They just end up being poor, and their concerns are not addressed effectively. One way forward in terms of studying, of course, is to look at these complex emergencies and to stop large-end studies of huge numbers of country years and cross-country studies, because they don't tell us anything about what we're looking for is the explanations to how this relationship works. And I think the IPCC is very good at pointing out that that's where the studies perhaps should go, is to identify those links more strongly than has been. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm not going to ask any questions now because I feel I would monopolize the next half hour, so I'll open it to the floor. Can you just raise your hand and be recognized and just state your name and affiliation for your question?
Norman Carter, an independent member. We've got a very interesting case study, if you like, today. There's the Global Water Summit in Paris. Now, what comes across very clearly from what you said, and I'm sorry I missed the first contribution, apologies for being late, is that it needs a great deal of interdisciplinarity brought to bear on the analysis of some of this data. How good do you think that is currently? Would it affect, for instance, would it be a factor in the case study we might look at today and determine some outcomes that might benefit from an earlier initial interdisciplinary approach?
Clinian, do you want to answer about interdisciplinarity? Or we both can?
We're both geographers, but that's inherently interdisciplinary. In many ways.
That's what a lot of people say about the subject.
I don't know. You know, I know I'm supposed to be pro interdisciplinary work, because everybody is, but if you're an economist and you're addressing conflicts, you're doing it through a framework that's looking at very particular factors and how they influence each other. And, you know, when you have multiple people looking at these same questions, you might actually obviously find that the issue becomes much wider, and that's the benefit of an interdisciplinary perspective. But you can also get quite fuzzy conclusions when you do so. I think that the conflict climate literature suffers quite a lot from fuzzy conclusions already.
But not for that reason?
It's in part the data, there's no question. The data is particularly, it's getting better, but it's particularly poor. But it's also, of course, that people who tend to do the types of analysis that look at these broad patterns, as we were saying, aren't trying to be invested in the politics within countries which might show them the ways in which climate change creates opportunities for violence or creates opportunities for people to use it as excuses for violence.
So my take on interdisciplinarity, having been an author on this IPCC report, is that there is a legitimacy for many disciplines now to examine climate change and its impacts and our relationship with climate and the rest of it. And I think that's absolutely fantastic, because I believe that we do need more interdisciplinarity, and we need more disciplines to be directly engaged with this. Not least some of the social science disciplines that have so far not been involved in it. And I mean, for example, management sciences, that, in terms of looking at the benefits of decarbonisation, but also anthropology and cultural studies to look at how we're going to experience climate change, which is effectively through wild weather, and what we, and sociology as well, what we know to be climate is just the weather that we expect, and the deviation from that is the thing that causes uncertainty and the thing that causes our distancing from the issue. So I think there are many, many gaps in our present set of knowledge that can't be filled necessarily by direct interaction with climate scientists, because I work a lot with climate scientists. We have methods and models, we look at broad-scale processes, but actually getting down to some of the on-the-ground processes and process tracing, both in political science and in other social sciences, is absolutely essential, I think, in terms of adaptation.
If I can just step in here in my role as a scholar in this field, rather than the moderator, because my educational background, my doctoral work, was in an interdisciplinary field, so I was sort of combining anthropology, history, a bit of humanities and literature, and focusing on the medieval period with a strong component of looking at the effect of environmental change. And so when I approach the modern climate change issue, I'm looking at it through that very broad, very synthetic approach. And so on the one hand, you've got these strong quantitative statistical studies that are useful for answering some questions and answering others. On the other hand, you have the individual country specialists who really know what's going on the ground. And often the objection to the kind of broad synthesis that I work on is that I'm missing a lot of that nuance. And of course, you can't be, if you're doing broad comparisons, you can't be an expert in every field you're doing. And I think there's a lot behind that criticism. It's quite true, but the people who are narrow-focused tend to miss the big picture because they are focused on these individual details and the nuance. So in that respect, you do need the sort of interdisciplinary and intermethodological discussions. And I think the particular strength of the Chapter 12, the Human Security chapter on that, is it does sort of cut through where these different approaches and the different disciplines agree, disagree, and where the gaps are. And even though some of the conclusions that I've drawn in my own research are stronger than would be suggested by this broad assessment, I think it's a very fair and a fair look at where the gaps in the research are and where more interdisciplinary discussion needs to be done and more and robust data needs to be gathered.
Edward Daly, Principal Wales' International Sustainability Unit. Thank you both for the very, very insightful and interesting presentations, and I look forward to reading the chapter. It's a question about any historical precedents in human communities that have been able to respond to natural resource scarcity, climate change in the past in a way which has overcome conflict or avoided transcendent possibility of conflict. Because I'd just be interested to explore that, because clearly the implications of this work is very significant in terms of the 21st century and what might ensue, whether it's in the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. It would be interesting to know if there were any good examples where, in the past.
All societies?
So I would say that that of course, for all sorts of impacts on negative human well-being and impacts for human security, there's a great focus on violent conflict and something of policy concern. But the whole history of agriculture is effectively one of cooperation, adapting to environment and cooperating in terms of water resources and various others. So I think the examples of good practice are everywhere. And of course, we're focused on the negative downside risks of when things are go wrong and when there are significant power imbalances and the rest of it. I did say in my comments that we conclude in the chapter that, of course, that once we're into worlds that we're not familiar with, and that take individuals outside and regions outside the realm of experience, then the past isn't such a good guide to the future. I've got absolutely no evidence for that, but it's certainly something that we should be worried about. And the one example I will give you is that if there were significant major climate shifts at the continental scale, then the incentives for unilateral geoengineering increase exponentially, and the impacts of geoengineering, particularly some solar radiation management technologies on adjacent regions, are unknowable, and probably negative, and the governance consequences of those are only going to be negative too.
I would concur. I mean, while I do think that looking at the past is quite instructive to some degree, the advancements of the last 50, 100 years make it seem maybe not as relevant to understanding how people are dealing with it at present. And there is far more cooperation than there is conflict, far more. But as Neil said, we don't focus on those because they don't bring attention. But again, it is this very important caveat. We don't exactly know what then would happen if we've reached some sort of threshold beyond which the societal ability to cooperate no longer functions like that.
And if I could just add one more thing on the historical stuff, some of the best or the most robust results showing a statistical connection between violent conflict and climate change going back to the last 2,000 years show a strong connection, but it's between cooling rather than warming. And going to what Neil said, the warming that we're experiencing now is outside the range of those studies. So that sort of evidence is not really a guide.
And it's also quite important, like the state system wasn't in place then. The state system is really quite critical to understand all violent conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
My name is Frank Kruger from the Swiss Embassy. In many parts of the world, we see a trend towards urbanization, that people are living more and more in big cities. Does that have a positive net effect, or is it? I mean, one could say it does increase the vulnerability, but also maybe it's a good way of adaptation to climate change. What is the overall assessment?
Very good question. This photograph, which will probably end up being the front cover of the, I suspect it's one of the candidates for our front cover of the report when it comes out in print, is of course is from the Netherlands, and is water management and flood risk management in the Netherlands. Cities. Now, where do I start? I mean, more than half the world's population live there. In terms of our immediate assessment, of course, is that the single biggest trend in the movement of people around the world is still from rural areas to urban areas around the world. So our report, rather than focusing on migration as an outcome of climate change, looks at migration as a system and basically shows that that climate change may have impacts on that demographic drift towards cities that is occurring naturally. Or it's occurring for economic reasons and for economic impetus all around the world. So cities are going to be absolutely the crucible of where the action is in terms of climate change, both in terms of high density, low income areas within cities where migrants and others of low income tend to live and maybe well be more exposed to the impacts of climate change, like flooding, landslides, access to public health, urban heat island, all sorts of impacts. But also the pathways that cities are going to take. Now, the biggest growth in cities, in terms of their geographical location around the world, are cities in large megadeltas. And you think, oh my goodness, they're going to be subject to, increased flood risk and increased salinization and all sorts of risks associated with sea level change. But work that we did, actually, it was from the Foresight report going a couple of years back, shows that those cities tend to be such important growth poles and primacy of their primary situation in the economies of the countries, like Dhaka and Mumbai and the rest of them, that actually they're going to be protected at all costs, and it's always going to be worthwhile to do so in terms of the engineering infrastructure, but they're still going to be at risk. And these cities, particularly in rapidly emerging economies, the carbon footprint of a resident of Shanghai is much higher than the carbon footprint of a resident of rural China. It's virtually it's the other way round in most cities in Europe, where an urban resident in London has probably got a lower carbon footprint than someone living in a rural Devon. So, where do we start on the importance of cities in this? Absolutely critical in terms of decarbonisation, and also in terms of where the impacts are going to be absolutely critical and socially differentiated, not least to do with heat and the exposure to it.
So from a conflict perspective, we're certainly seeing a decrease of conflict in what might be considered quite rural areas, and that is coming along with the decrease in civil wars that has been occurring for the last 10 years or so. And you're definitely seeing a move of violence into urban areas, not necessarily capital cities, but certainly where people congregate. So conflict follows people. It's not exactly too difficult. But what we are seeing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is that migrants going into urban areas are interacting with a political system that in fact has quite a pronounced rural bias. So urban areas tend to support regime opponents, and so therefore they're often starved of funding. So we have a very, very high rate of urban vulnerability, in part because it's politically beneficial to the regime to starve these people who vote for the opponents. The centres of power within African states are still rural areas, mainly because it's one of the it's one of the areas of the world that is the least urbanized, and so there's just a concentration of demography there, and so therefore political power. And so migrants kind of suffer a double jeopardy in that they move to areas that are not being attended to very well at all for maybe lack of capacity, but also very clear political reasons. But they don't necessarily use their political power to try and change anything because of this very, very delicate situation that they're in, which is that this migration is often kind of not supported by the state, but quite often migrants are used as scapegoats in political contests.
Thank you. David Buchan, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Just on your last point, I thought...
Just to me, sorry, or Clina?
Well, sorry.
Not sure where your point
is. Yes, your colleague. I thought there was some evidence that, for instance, in African countries, rulers tended to keep food prices low, because to please the towns, because frankly the towns is where the instability is going to arise, and that's where if there's going to be a coup, they're going to be toppled, not from the countryside.
So that's the urban bias thesis from Robert Bates from the 80s. And in the 80s and during autocratic governments, you do see quite a bit more attention to urban areas, because the governments know that collective action in urban areas is much more likely to occur rather than kind of underdeveloped rural areas. With democratization and the contest becoming not autocratic but based on demography, you saw quite a substantial shift to what's referred to now as a rural bias.
Can I just ask a supplementary, arising out of a comment that Geoffrey made about past studies being focused on the effect of cooling on human behaviour? I just wondered whether it's what's my question? The cooling has forced people to cooperate more than warming has. So I'm not a geographer or a specialist in this area, but in a very sort of broad way, if you look at tropical societies, they have the tropical belt of the world has produced slightly less sophisticated states and societies, and then the higher latitudes, towards the poles, where you've had to cooperate more to keep warm, to construct more complicated houses or heating systems. And so I'm not quite sure what my question is, actually. Maybe you could formulate a question.
Well, let me have a go. Let me come up with an alternative hypothesis that what we as a species don't like, well, let's not go as quite that broad. What most businesses and actually what most economic systems don't like is uncertainty. And heating and cooling, basically, while it doesn't matter what the trend is, that it's something that is uncertain. An increase in variability basically increases uncertainty, and therefore you have to be more risk averse, and doesn't allow efficient use of resources and the rest of it. So I think this debate about climate. And you can see, climate is the average of weather, and you can talk about it in these broad parameters. And I've talked about it even as we do in the IPCC report, about 2 degrees of warming, or 3 degrees of warming or beyond, hides the reality of how we experience climate. How we experience climate is whether or not it's the weather that we expect. And if we get the weather we don't expect, that has all sorts of negative consequences. It doesn't matter if that's in the tropics or in the high latitudes, which are receiving the greatest absolute levels of warmth, as you see, particularly in the northern high latitudes or in the temperate regions. So I think it's deviation from expectation that makes a huge that makes all the difference. That has economic costs and also spills over into social and political costs.
I would concur. How's that?
There you go. Speak the same language.
I was just wondering if you'd come to the same conclusion on the El Nino effect, because I read a study last year that was published by a team at Berkeley, I think, and they were talking about how the El Nino effect had a correlation with violence. Mm-hmm. But presumably the El Nino effect is not uncertain in the same way that you just said, because they do know that it is going to happen, but they saw the same correlation. So that was to do with climate variation, but something that could be predicted, maybe not concretely. But
well, both of the go, but I'll pass to Clina first on this one.
So, firstly, from a climate perspective, I'm under the impression that the actual local effects of El Nino can be quite variable, and so therefore it does introduce some variability into the system, thereby upsetting the balance or the expectations of people living in it. I would say that there's quite a lot of skepticism, healthy skepticism, about some of the results from that team, which have been methodologically quite advanced, but pose some questions about whether or not these are purely quantitative results and may in fact be spurious, because they're very difficult to back up in actual circumstances. The same team said that civil wars and increasing temperatures are correlated, and then when asked to explain, they said it was hot in Uganda in the 80s. I mean, that doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't bring us to any sort of new understanding about the relationship. And so I would caution against very clear physical relationships being associated with political circumstances.
Let me just add to that. I mean, El Nino clearly, comes from the Peruvian anchovy fishermen that knew that, once every 7 years there was a change in resource abundance and scarcity. So in some ways this is built into, cultures that experience weather. But as Clina said, whenever you're on the ground, whether or not it's in northeast Brazil or in East Africa or places that actually experience, or all around the tropics and extratropics that actually experience the impacts of or changes in patterns associated with El Nino years, that doesn't really mean anything. In the 97, 98 El Nino, there were lots of taxis in Nairobi that called themselves El Nino, and everything was sort of attributed to El Nino, from violence to pestilence and the rest of it. But that doesn't mean to say that you experience or know about it. It changes the hurricane tracks in the Atlantic But knowing that it's an El Nino year doesn't probably make me any less susceptible to the impacts of a hurricane through Central America. So there may be a broad pattern. Certainly the statistics are contested, but I'm not sure that really helps us.
Just one more question, if I may. To me, what the science shows effectively is this is going to be almost impossible to deal with if you have a 4-degree rise. It's just about feasible to deal with it if it's a 2-degree rise, where even then the implications are very severe and probably unmanageable in some areas. Therefore, the overwhelming moral, ethical, scientific imperative is to try and ensure global GHG mitigation whilst there's still time. The implications of all that are incredibly significant in terms of stranded assets and in terms of global energy transition and the like. But in essence, is it true to say that the science effectively demonstrates the overwhelming need to undertake a transition whilst there's still time?
A good question. A journalist question. Is it true to say that? To which, how can I answer? Absolutely. I would go slightly further than that. The impetus for decarbonisation is absolutely enormous. In the report, or in our team, we talk about the era of climate commitment. We're committed to warming over the next, it's the laws of physics, over the next 2 or 3 decades, because of increased emissions, because of absorption of heat in the oceans, all sorts of reasons why we're basically committed to more warming and more destabilisation of the climate. We absolutely have to adapt to that. Now, there is a bit, as far as this is my personal interpretation, there's a bit of implicit recalibration of the risk language within this fifth assessment, where, because for the first time there are scientific studies, and our job is to hold a mirror up to the academic community, to the scientific community, and say, this is what you're saying. There are more studies looking at the high-end impacts at 4 degrees, that we have concluded that 4 degrees brings about pervasive and highly detrimental impacts. And that's bad. 2 degrees, because we think in a linear fashion, is half as bad, because it's only halfway there. Whereas we know that the EU's target, and actually much of the science that underpinned that, says that actually 2 degrees is bad, 4 degrees is absolutely catastrophic. But because we're now talking about 2 and 4 degrees, 2 being half of 4, we've recalibrated the risk language within this. There is absolutely no evidence, or is no significant evidence, that that natural systems, the biological and physical world, is any better adapted, or is any less sensitive to 2 degrees than we thought 5 or 10 years ago. Coral reefs, for example, there's some evidence of particular types of coral that do survive bleaching, and you do see evolutionary change in coral systems, and there's various things. But in effect, all the coral reef scientists are still saying 2 degrees probably highly detrimental. I'll not say the end of the world's coral. There's all sorts of coral species that will survive in high CO2 environments, because don't forget, and high acidic environments. Don't forget the world's oceans are changing. But there's basically no evidence that the physical and biological world is any less sensitive than we thought before to 2 degrees of warming. 4 is just something we're contemplating or that the science is contemplating and trying to make sense of, because in a way because of 10 years of not decarbonising the world and no prospect of emissions peaking before 2020 or whenever. So, I don't like to be alarmist, but it's certainly sobering if you read this assessment in detail.
I would just like to add to that that this debate has been very pivotal in that it's highlighted how sensitive people's livelihoods are within developing countries, and I'm not entirely sure that any sort of carbon regulation will help that situation, which is now present and obvious and clearly getting worse. So whether or not the temperature increases by 2 or 4 is not someplace that I can contribute, but the variability of the temperature and how it averages out throughout the year, or whatever the case, is having significant impacts on how people can survive. that is particularly unsettling if we consider them the most vulnerable.
Okay, well, yeah,
One
sure.
minute at the end. Charlotte Fetzer from the Institute. I heard that the human security chapter was one over which there was significant wrangling about final language. Is that the case? And if so, did those kind of contestations come from comments from governments? And do you have a sense of how that chapter in particular has been received and its implications have been received by governments?
Good question. I think the whole of the IPCC, and I would include our chapter, it's been an absolute privilege to be involved in it. We've had this international team of authors. Clearly some of the underlying science is contested. We are looking for a balance across multiple lines of evidence, and I haven't even talked about the impact on indigenous peoples and the impact on food systems, food security, on health, many other dimensions to this. For this particular audience. We received, I will have to look up numbers, hundreds of pages of comments on it from the research community. To date, it's been very well received. I have to say, I would have imagined that using the terms security, national security, and the rest of it would draw some attention from the world's governments. In aggregate, the world's governments in Yokohama last week were extremely supportive of this, the report, the whole report in general. And you may not believe me, but actually I would say that there was actually, that this really is a consensus study in the community, and a consensus, and governments are pretty, they're actually asking for more information, at least for the summary for policymakers. So the governments, these headline statements I put up, and there are many others about the impacts in different parts of the world and different dimensions of risk. The governments are generally very, very supportive, and are convinced by these. Whether or not that translates into action for decarbonisation or even for adaptation, and taking on board some of the recommendations, like the best way to reduce the impact of insecurity of ill health is through investment in public health. There are significant benefits to investing in the robust institutions for transboundary water resource conflict. There are ways to reduce vulnerability by equitable and balanced economic development. Whether or not these messages get through is quite another matter.
And they're just good practice.
Sorry?
They're just good practice. Good governance.
We're sort of out of time. We're at the end of our scheduled time. I did have one question I'd like to address, and it's more of a narrow one. This would have been a good place to stop with these sort of broad conclusions. But I have a narrow question in keeping with the main focus of the IISS, and that is this discussion of the climate conflict nexus has cropped up a lot in the security community discourse, and the defense reviews, the general defense reviews in the United States, for example. And in a way, it's a question of adaptation of the defense sector to the expected impacts of climate change in terms of force structures and force planning and things. Do you think the evidence on climate and conflict is sufficiently robust, or is not sufficiently robust to affect that kind of planning with, say, a 20, 30-year time horizon at the moment?
I think the 20, 30-year time horizon, I'm not going to do one of those things where we start, putting $10 down and say, come back in 20 years and see what the climate's like. 20 to 30-year time horizon is a pretty important one. I think the impacts of climate change, or the impacts of the increased energy in the atmosphere and this, basically in the climate system, are going to be felt in that sort of time frame. The next 2 or 3 decades is when the reality of this is all going to start to be felt very, very significantly in terms of covariate risk of agricultural production and all sorts of things, loss of Arctic sea ice, impacts on ecosystems, dieback of corals, and I guess it's not just the security and defence sector that needs to be aware of that, and in the 2 to 3 decade time horizons?
I've been very impressed by how the U.S. military, in particular, has tried to open themselves up to some of the much more case-based understandings of what's going on in the developing world, and also how technology might be able to make them a particularly robust fighting force in the future. And climate change affects both of those things. But instead of taking a largely kind of technological perspective on it, they seem to, in my experience, have spent a lot more time trying to understand these new contexts better than they have before, potentially to avoid being entrenched in environments where they know are volatile and don't necessarily know what to do within them. So perhaps it's given them an opportunity to expand their own horizons.
Right, well, thank you very much for a very informative pair of talks and discussion.
Thank you.